And we are COMP1004 and rapid application development here at Georgian in the winter 2017 semester, and we are week 8, part 1. And okay, what are we talking about today? So as I said to people that were here in class today, I'm fairly happy with the submissions that I saw over the break for the midterm assignment, as well as assignment 3. I think most of you got it in, which is good, on time. I think there's only a few of you that have not yet submitted. Submit as soon as possible, because again, 20% per day means that, you know, in a couple of days it won't make any sense to submit anything at all. Those people who haven't submitted, please see me either during the break or after class. Okay, so what are we talking about today? Today, if you follow the schedule of events, is database 1. We're talking about how to integrate database or some kind of data store with our user interfaces. I mean, user interfaces or UIs are neat, but they're kind of useless without some kind of data backing them up. What is the syntax and what are we using? I'm going to be talking about a couple ways. There's the old way and there's the new way. Those two things. The other thing I talked about briefly last time was your final project in this course, which I'm going to do with Unity. In order for us to do that, I need to kind of talk about the user interface for Unity. What I'm asking you to do now is, because this is a BYOD, bring your own device kind of class, is please, and if you're interested in doing something with Unity, please download and install Unity. It is free. Students, you don't have to pay anything, right? So it's just that they keep on changing everything here, right? If I go click Get Unity Now, there are different levels of Unity: Personal, Plus, Pro, and Enterprise. Obviously, you don't need these three. Right now, we're just learning Unity, so from a personal edition would be fine. Students, notice that the revenue capacity is 100K. So if you make more than 100K, then you need to move on to some other version of Unity. I'm hoping you'll all make more than 100K from some app you're going to make. So if you do, that's great. If that's your problem, it's a good problem to have. All right, I always think of it like that. So if I download Unity, download now button, it comes in different versions. Notice the latest version is 5.5.2. If you're not quite there, and I may not be quite there, if I run my Unity version, yep, I may not be at 5.5.2. That's okay. Is a bit of a pain. I'm at 5.5.1. That's okay. So I'm going to update mine later on, not today. In class, I would do this at home. And I'll tell you why. It takes a bit of time to download and install if you're going to do this whole Unity thing anyway. How about if you're someone who's not interested in gaming, you don't want to, Unity, because you don't think there's any kind of, reason for it. Well, remember that Unity can be used for a variety of things, for games, like some kind of shoot 'em up game or a 2D game or anything like that. It could be used for serious games. So serious games meaning term for things like tutorials, right? So if you're going to make a tutorial for an application, you can do it with Unity. If you're going to make a tutorial for some institution, sometimes we do it in Unity as well, because you can make it almost gamify the learning experience, right? So don't just think of Unity as a place to make games. Obviously, that's the main reason why we use it, but you can use it for cross-platform interface development, because this is not a gaming course, right? This is a rapid application development course, so we're going to talk about Unity as an additional platform so you can deploy things, for example, on iOS and Android. And go with it. Unity. Sorry? No. This is just one thing we're going to do today. So please download. If you haven't had a chance to do that before next class, please download and install Unity. Now, how big is it? It's big, right? And if I start downloading this thing, this says that you need some requirements and so on. It takes all kinds of room. I'll tell you right now, it could be up to 30 gigs depending on what you download, right? It's a small build. That's why I told you don't do it here in class. You're just going to kill our bandwidth, and you still won't finish by the end. It takes you might finish in 3 hours, but it does take a good hour to install properly. Please and don't try and select only part of the things. And I'll tell you why. Because some people might say, well, I don't need this, I don't need that, I don't need this. You know, you might as well install everything. If you're going to use Unity, use Unity. Download the whole thing, right? Which again takes about 30 gigabytes. Yeah. You download again, and then what happens is there's no upgrade path. If you actually click, check for updates, it's going to say there's no update. And I'll show you that in a second when we launch Unity. So again, we're using it for user interface building, rapid application development. We're not using this for games necessarily. I am going to show you the interface. Probably going to use a little bit with Unity is some kind of, graphic manipulation program. You could use GIMP. It's also free. I'm probably going to either use GIMP, or even if I use Photoshop or something like that, I need some kind of graphics if I'm going to put them up, especially when it comes to buttons, because it comes up with its own buttons, some other interface elements you have to create. So things you may cover in the second half are Blender. Go to blender.org, right? Blender is about an 80 megabyte download. I think it's worthwhile to get to know how to use Blender to create 3D assets. We're going to do a little bit of that this half, not a lot, because again, this is not a advanced graphics kind of creation course, right? But I'm probably going to go into Blender. If anything, what I'll do this semester is if I create something, I'll share it with you on Slack. Like here's a an asset. Here it is. I'm not going to ask you to know it, to understand it. I'm not going to test you on it. It's not about that. Thing we do with on the Unity side, or even on things with Blender, we can always revisit or reuse in Visual Studio. We'll talk about that. PC person, which most of you are. You actually edit everything in Visual Studio. Everything you code in Unity will be done in C#. So all the stuff we've already learned in terms of general coding C# is transferable to something like Unity. So it's not like you're going to have to relearn a whole new language. Yeah. How much room do you have in your Mac? How much room do you have in your Mac? Yeah, check it out. If you have 80 gigs left, let's say, as something like that, you don't want to kill your Mac's room either. Like I'm down to about 50 gigs myself, and I get nervous for around 50 gigs, right? Remember, I have a terabyte. I only have 50 gigs left, right? So that's how crazy I am with loading stuff up, right? And every semester I usually clean that up, and I'm down to about 100 again, all right? I was going back to that. I would highly recommend that if you have at least more than 50 gigs left on your device and install native. I think it's better native. Trying to run Unity in a VM is crazy. It's nuts. It's nuts. It'll be really, really slow, because remember, Unity uses an OpenGL version that's at least 4 or higher typically, or DirectX. And DirectX doesn't really do well in VMs. So, you may not be able to run anything within your VM at all properly. So, I like the whole VM concept, but I think running native is the way to go. No, I wouldn't use VMware. I think it's too heavy duty, right? Maybe.
Linux kernels that can do it. Load up a Linux kernel on a server, bunch of hardware in it.
Yeah.
That's pretty effective, but.
Again, I don't recommend. It's better to be on the metal, right? If anything, it's better. You know what you would want to do if you're a Mac user? Build another Windows 10 platform that's native, and you run it in a bootcamp mode. So it actually uses the metal. That's the most recommended version, right? So that way, if you want to run in Windows, if you're someone who wants to do games on your Mac, I don't know why, but let's say, for example, you want to do games on your Mac, you'd want to run it on the metal, which means you probably want to run it in bootcamp mode. More Windows-centric applications like 3D Studio Max doesn't work on Mac anyway, or anything like that. So you're probably best doing it in that environment. If you want to change anything and you have room, I would recommend native. Go native. Download it, install on the Mac. Don't try and do it on VMware. You're going to have a bad experience, right? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about this in probably the last hour. We'll try and give it an hour. Not right now. We're going to start off with the other stuff first. So again, I would recommend Blender for sure. Definitely get Unity. If you're someone who likes to have free open source tools, if you're a free open source guy, then things like GIMP would be a nice graphic manipulation program, right? That's really what it is. It's a little clunky, I'll have to tell you, right? It's not like Photoshop, right? But it's not bad. The other one that I like a lot lately is Krita. Oh, Krita. Very similar to GIMP. If you're going to use things, again, open source platform. Again, if you're a Mac user, I would use this native. I wouldn't go any kind of graphic manipulation program or any graphics, anything. I would go native as much as possible. So on the metal is what I'm talking about, not in a VM. The third one that I can recommend is Inkscape. All of them do very similar things. That I can tell you that Inkscape is more like Illustrator. You know, GIMP is more like a Photoshop, and Krita is kind of in the middle. It kind of does a little bit of both, right? Krita is the one you want to use on Photoshop. I do subscribe to Adobe, so I have my full Photoshop suite all up to date. So I would probably be using something like Fireworks, but all the the programs run very similarly across the just features than others, and we're not going to use any of these features. I'm buying Photoshop for the remainder of the course. Don't do that, right? If you're not using Photoshop for anything else, that'd be a big waste of your time and money. You can use one of these other free programs. There's no cost involved here. You're good to go. Things that you might need for the second half, and again, based on what you're going to do here in Unity. So let's say after you finish installing Unity, what does it look like? So I've got my Unity project here. I'm just recording this for you guys to see it as an overview. Then what we see in Visual Studio, you there's a getting started piece, which kind of gives you a whole tutorial on how to use Unity and so on, and what Unity can do. We're not going to do that. Notice that I can run it on disk or in the cloud. Unity has a cloud build service, which is really cool, locally. And if I click on New for Unity, for people who have it already installed, and if I have a new project, let's just call this project COMP1004 Winter 2017, and we'll say it's lesson 8, right? I have on my desktop, if you notice, I have this users Thomas desktop Unity project, so all my Unity projects go in the same place. I do not recommend enabling Unity Analytics for this one. Modes, 2D and 3D, right? For today, I'm going to just talk about Unity in its basic mode, which is the default is 3D. We're going to probably use 2D, yeah, why not? Follow along if you got it, right? But I'm going to give you some time. So by the end of class, if you've downloaded it somehow, or if you're going to do it if you're going to watch the video, then you can do it there. Notice that it also says here, you can, if you choose 3D or 2D, what is this 3D and 2D? It is the way that the camera and the default settings are set up in the beginning. 3D to 2D if I really want to, absolutely, I can. Set up my whole project so it's 2D, even if I chose 3D. I can also go back from 2D to 3D. This is just setup. That's all it works out to be, right? If you notice, there's add asset packages. You can add things like some basic packages. If you download anything from the Unity store, and I'm not going to do that here, but you can reuse, which is kind of cool. And there's an amazing Unity store that they have that's up that Unity has provided, where people can share their projects, sell you bits of their projects as starters, right? So I mean, I'm talking about everything from, I don't know, level design toolkits to even scripting. I mean, there's everything up there. If you want to check out the Unity store, you search for Unity store. Someone who's an Unreal person, they have the Unreal Marketplace as well. They're both very good to get. But here's an example of the Unity store, and it looks very much like an app store, right, of all different kinds. If I want to do things like, for example, I want to download some 3D models, you can find some 3D models that are free and some 3D models that are $100, right, or more, right? So you can, like, here's an example of a city and terrace pack. If you want to build a city, okay, It's just to build a city, right? Again, if you're a real gamer or game maker, you're probably not going to do this. You're probably going to make your own or get someone to make it for you. But if you're someone who's, who wants to rapidly create games, rapid application development, it's okay. Or Unity-like, however, I'll tell you, like when you start making stuff, unless you really dress up Unity, everything you make with Unity looks Unity-like. Just like everything you do with Bootstrap looks Bootstrappy, and everything you do with WordPress looks WordPressy. Or everything you do with Unreal looks Unreal-y, right? It's all the same. It kind of has this own flavor because everyone has their default, code that kind of makes things work and feel a certain way. Purposes, it's perfectly fine, and it's more than enough. Let's go back to this. So here I'm going to say, okay, create my new project. It's going to bring up, now again, if you're using Unity 5.5 anything, you're going to be okay. You're going to be with me. If you're using 5.4 or earlier, then it's going to look different than this. All right, so here's the Unity interface. Let's just talk about this a little bit, and we'll talk about this later on as well. Notice my screen will look different than yours. The default way that it starts off when you launch Unity for the first time, if you look at the default layout, which is the layout right here, it will look like this. This is the default layout. And what it is on the left is your hierarchy. I want you to think about this as your scene graph. Everything that's inside of your screen, anything that you can see in the screen, are listed here. Any objects. That's everything from buttons to game objects to whatever. They're all going to be listed right here. Notice that there are two objects that are listed here automatically. One is main camera. The other one is directional light. All right? Again, you don't have to worry about this right now. I just wanted to show you where everything is in this video. On the left, there's a big project area. And this is the default setting. When we set up Unity, we have to set up all of our folders and the folder structure ourselves, right? And it's super important. Unity, by the way, it's not opinionated about how you set things up, but there's a recommendation about how to do things. Everything we see here on the main window in the middle is considered a scene, right? It's a scene. So if I want to add new objects to the scene, I need to have a scene file that kind of wraps all my objects up, right? And therefore, I got to save all of my scenes, screens, right? Levels. You can think about it different ways, right? For example, my menu scene could be its own level, kind of level, right? And then I have my main game or my main utility, whatever I'm going to do with the middle scene. And then the last scene might be a game over scene or some kind of other transition scene. Each scene is its own world. I want you to think about it as its own container. So we need to store these scenes somewhere, and my recommendation is we kind of create a folder structure like this layout, okay? For a couple of reasons. Notice also that there's two different kind of, this is kind of in a tabular format. You have your scene where you can drag and drop different things. And notice if I left click, scroll out here with my wheel. If I left click on any one of these things, notice that on the right, my inspector is contextual. So it kind of reflects what I'm clicking on. Click here, shows what it shows. Fantastic. Same thing with my directional. I can click over here on the hierarchy. This is my hierarchy. And again, my inspector will show what I'm clicking on. So I don't like this layout, and I think the best way to start off is to change our layout together so we kind of conform to the same one. So I'm going to go to a 2x3 layout, right? Starting off. And you have a couple things. You have your scene up here, and then there's something called game here. This is what your actual game will look like at the end, down here. And what I like to do for now is initially I hide it by putting it back up there. So you can tear off any tabs you want and put them wherever you like in your interface. The interface 101, what I'm showing you right now, okay? And the same thing with my hierarchy. Notice that my hierarchy is here and my project is here, taking this whole space. I have a lot of assets. I don't for this one. So I'm going to just take my whole tab here and tear it off and put it down here. I have suddenly a whole bunch more room over here, right? So I can actually see what my scene looks like. And this is typically how I set things up for myself. And this is what you're going to see me. I'm going to start off looking different than yours. I'm also going to pull this up to be about the same. Notice it says assets. all of your resources for your project for Unity starts off in the assets folder, okay? Now inside the assets folder, I recommend the following folder hierarchy. Here, notice that there is a little slider control. Let me just right click here, and if I go right click anywhere, actually, here, right here, you see that I have context menus, right? So in here, notice the assets is highlighted. That means inside the assets folder, I'm going to create something else. And you notice if I kind of follow the menu, my folder will look like a folder in this particular case by default. The first folder I'm going to create is underscore scenes. Underscore because underscore will come at the top of my assets. So I want to see my scenes first at the top. I don't want them to go in alphabetical. Right? This is a massive folder and it doesn't really show me anything. I like to have everything differently. Again, if you notice, I can zoom up what my folder will look like here with my slider control way back, so it looks like a list, which is much easier for me to look at, right? Scenes. One I also want in there, I want scenes underscore scripts. This is where all of our C# scripts are going to be kept, right? Because we need C# to basically power all the stuff we're going to be doing here in Unity. So scenes and scripts, those are the two things you're going to see me do here a lot. I think this is a good start. Of textures or anything like textures will be images we're going to use, I would probably create another folder for textures. Now this would not include an underline. I might also include another folder for models. Any kind of models, three-dimensional or two-dimensional models I might bring in, I might include them here, right? Models, textures. If I had audio in my game, you can make another folder, and I would kind of create more and more folders as we go. I'm not going to make too many more. The one that's really important is something called prefabs. So I'm going to right click here on the bottom and create another one called prefabs with a capital P. Over and over again. Prefabs, that's what they are. Okay? Think about them as class objects. I'm going to create a class, right? And then I can reuse them in over and over again. For now, this is good. How does this translate, by the way, to a folder structure on the operating system? We should look at that, see what it looks like, right? Because I want you to still connect to GitHub with this thing, right? Warning, Unity, GitHub, don't play nice, right? Be honest, right? There is another new tool that they've come up with over the last 6 months called Colab, right? Which allows you to collaborate, that's why it's called Colab, with other people. Please don't use this for now, right? It's nice, but it's not as version control system-wise, it's not the same as GitHub. I will tell you how to do things. You will not be collaborating with anybody anyway, in this case, so you're okay with what I tell you to do. So I've created this empty scene. This is an empty scene, and I'm looking at the game side. There's two. There's the scene view and the game view. Game view is what it will look like in the game. Scene is what it looks like when you drag and drop stuff in here. I need to save this scene, and so I can say File, Save Scenes, and it's going to pull up. It's going to ask you this little dialog. Where do you want me to save things? It's got to be under scenes, right? Where I created the scenes folder, and I'm going to call this main scene main. That's the first scene, right? You can call it start scene or whatever you want to. And notice when I double click inside my scenes folder now, I have this main scene. And if you want to make it bigger, it's not big enough for you to see. You can see that it can become either an icon or a list item. And I like it as a list item. Why did I do this? Because when you save your scene, anything you've dragged and dropped into it will be saved. If you don't save your scene and you exit Unity, anything you've done in your scene, gone. Please don't do that. Make sure you save often, right, with this. Simple demonstration. I want to add a primitive shape to my scene. What are the primitive shapes? Cube, a cone, a torus, plane. Those are basic primitive shapes. If I want to add something like that to my scene, right? My camera itself, notice there's a little camera preview right here. It tells you what you can see in the scene. Now, there's also these three manipulator arms here. What are these three manipulator arms? Anybody who knows? X, Y, Z. What's this one? Y, right? Yeah. And you might be surprised because if you're using Blender, it's Z up. Here in Unity, we're Y up, which is a messed up thing, right? Because if you drag and drop stuff from Blender to Unity, by the way, which is a nice little workflow, right? You make something in Blender or another three-dimensional program, manipulation program, drag it in. You can do that, drag and drop, and it'll accept this thing. And it might be different, right? So just keep this in mind. So how do I tumble around the scene? Well, we're going to do that in a second. Let's just right-click here inside the hierarchy, and I can use a new three-dimensional object, which I'm going to include a cube. Here's my cube. There it is. It's right on top of the camera, right? And let's also add, why? Because I've clicked on my main camera. Notice that there is a bit of a, how the main camera and the cube are together. This is wrong. That means that the cube is a child of the main camera. I don't want that. I want to kind of drag this over here. Now the cube is not a child of anything. Also, on the right, every game object in Unity has a transform. Now, if you're someone who took linear algebra, anyone not take linear algebra? I'm talking about like matrices and vectors and that kind of stuff. If you've never taken linear algebra, this is going to be like Greek to you. Sorry to say that. I'm a Greek guy, I can say that. Anyway, so if you've never taken it. But what this is position, rotation, and scale. These things here, this transform component, and by the way, Unity uses a component-based system to create your scene. Every object is full of components. The basic component of all game objects, in fact, the game object superclass always includes something called a transform. The transform has position, location, location, rotation, and scale, or position, rotation, and scale. And notice it's an X, Y, and Z. If I look at the cube is at Z minus 10, which means in the Z is the blue arrow. And notice it's hard to see this. I'm going to zoom in. I'm zooming in by scrolling with my mouse wheel. Okay, but you know, I'm zooming kind of in the middle of my scene here, and if I want to kind of zoom into this, I'm going to use the F key. It's a shortcut that I want you to remember for Unity. What it's going to do is it's going to do something called frame select. It's frame select mode. So I'm going to go in here. By the way, if you're familiar with Maya, Unity and Maya almost use the exact same key sets, right? So key shortcuts. All right. So notice that I have my cube selected, and there's a little bit of an orange outline. This is new for Unity 5.5, right? Orange outline that outlines my object. And on the top here, you notice that there's a hand. There's these little handlebars, these arrows. There's something that looks like these, kind of rotation. And there's this one here that allows me to change things around. And depending on what I want to choose, right? And I'm going to try and look at this manipulator. This is called the gizmo, right? This gizmo. If I use this first tool, and by the way, if you want to know the shortcut keys to this, it's Q, W, E, R, T, right? Very, very simple. I know, but that's good, right? It's nice and easy. By the way, it's the same shortcuts in Maya, if you're a Maya person, right? So if I click on W, you can see that I'm going to get the manipulator arms. And if I drag the cube from one of these arrows, it's going to drag it in that direction. Notice that I'm seeing the cube in a projection view. It looks like I'm looking at it in a three-dimensional projection. Am I really seeing 3D? No, I'm actually looking at my two-dimensional screen, but it looks like it's 3D. And we're making this happen by using some kind of backend. It doesn't use OpenGL. It uses something called CG in terms of how Unity creates its view, right? But you can see now that if I zoom in and if I kind of scroll down, I can kind of make this appear that it's like a 3D object in three-dimensional space. But it's not. It's actually just me, my viewport. My viewport is looking at it like it's a 3D projection, right? So objects in 3D in real life appear bigger when they come closer, and objects in real life, when they're farther away, they look smaller. But really, the objects don't change size, right? Otherwise, I don't know, we would keep on changing size. I don't know how that would be. It's some kind of weird, otherworldly physics, right? Where we keep on changing size. They stay the same size, but they appear to be smaller when they're farther away, right? Not so in 2D. In 2D, you notice on the top left corner, there is this 2D button. If I click on this 2D button, now I'm seeing everything flat, right? 2D actually is looking at things in something called an orthographic mode, right? Where I only see things from one dimension, right? Or from two dimensions, if you will, the X and Y, right? We don't see really the Z dimension at all, right? That's all that 2D is, right? It's not like, it's not in 3D. It's actually a three-dimensional shape, just limited to one plane, right? That's what we do. So Unity does that when it creates its three-dimensional or two-dimensional games or utility programs or whatever. We actually just look at it from one perspective, right? Just from the front. You can still do that if you wanted to do that with in 3D. Notice on the top right here, you have your manipulator right here. You can see that I can look, if I click on any one of these, I look at it from a certain perspective, but it's still in 3D. So if I move it around, by the way, I want to tumble around with Unity, right? If I click into the mouse itself, so if I look at the mouse itself, you need a three-dimensional mouse, a 3-button mouse for this. If you don't have a 3-button mouse and you're using your touchpad, you will have a hard time with Unity and Blender and everything else. So please get yourself a 3-button mouse. They're like 20 bucks, 25 bucks if you want to pay an expensive price. However, I can recommend you can find ones for like 8 bucks through Amazon, right? So if you want to find that out, it's a cheap little purchase. You don't want to spend a lot of money. If you go to Amazon.ca, I recently bought 12 of them. If I say wired mouse, right? And you can notice that there is, different mice for different costs. Look, there's like 10 bucks, $9, a Belkin mouse for 9 bucks. This is perfectly fine. You wouldn't have to do something different than this, right? However, you can also sort in Amazon by how much money it costs. Like right now, it's sorted by relevance. You can sort by low to high. And you can see that there are, not those, avoid those, right? But there are some really, fairly reasonable priced mice. I want to give you the one that I like, if I can find it, for the price. And we're talking about mice that are around 8 bucks. So you can spend $8, shipping included, right? So that's why I recommend it. I'm not going to tell you to spend a lot of money on a mouse. If you're lazy and you want to buy it at the bookstore, they have them there too, but they're like 25, 30 bucks. And I don't know why you'd spend that money on something that we're not doing as a full-time thing this semester. So I'm going to scroll down here. 15 bucks, thank you. Right, so that's not bad. But again, if you're someone who doesn't want to spend too much money and you're a student, I'm going to go down here to the next page. I'll show you the one that I like. Again, they're like, you can see there's like tons of them, right? Like 5 bucks, whatever. But some of these are really cool. But I want to give you the one that I know that works. You might buy one for 3 bucks, but the problem is it won't come on time. Notice that there is a shipping involved, a lot of these. And also the delivery date is like a month out, right? That doesn't serve you anyway at all, right? So, because they come from China, a lot of them, right? So instead of coming from China or some other place, you can get them fairly close. We're almost there. Amazon Prime, yeah, that's probably what I should do. Yeah, I recommend it, by the way. 7. Trying to see the one I like that I recommend. I can recommend one because I know I've used it, right? So these aren't that bad, actually. Anything after around this price, you're probably going to be okay. But you don't want to use, I don't recommend wireless for 3 bucks. Okay, if you're going to buy a wireless mouse for 3 bucks, that is just, you're asking for trouble. Right, so let's just do what he said. Let's do Prime here. And we'll go by price low to high. That's really weird. 745. Yeah. G. Yeah, it's probably going to be one of these. Like these are actually pretty good. Anything in this range here, right? Actually took it down, the one I liked. I probably bought too many of them. But this one probably would anything with 3 buttons would do for around anything under 10 bucks. You're going to be okay. So you don't spend a lot of money. Even the ones like, look, this is right from Logitech for 20. I don't recommend that. You're going to spend 20 bucks for nothing. But this $9 mouse from Belkin, you're going to be fine, right? You need one for the second half. If you're going to do Unity at all, and you try and do it with your touchpad, you're looking for trouble. All right, please don't do that. Get yourself a 3-button mouse. I know you, a lot of younger students are of the touchpad generation. You never use a 3-button mouse in your life, right? I'm just saying, there's a lot of people like that. Please don't do that for this one. For this second half, get yourself a mouse. Okay, so why did I show you this stuff? Because you need to have your 3-button mouse in order for you to do certain things. Here's another thing. If I right-click on my mouse, I can kind of tumble around the scene, right? Notice I can do that, right, with my right-clicking. If I use Control, or sorry, if I use Alt, right, here's my Alt. I can zoom in and out. I can kind of pan in and out, if you will.
Right? Alt right-click?
Alt right click, yes, Alt right click. If I use Control right click, nothing happens. If I use, again, if you're a Mac user, if you use Command right click, same thing, nothing happens, no difference. If I use Alt Shift right click, notice it kind of zooms in and out much quicker, right? If I scroll in and out with my wheel, I can do this. If I Control and if I click into my mouse wheel. So if you look at the mouse wheel itself, if I actually click into the mouse wheel and hold it down and drag it around, I actually move the entire scene around, right? As opposed to pan around, right? So which is this way, or tumble. This would be more of a tumble, right? So these are things to understand. Okay, cool. So I got my cube. What does it look like in the game world? Well, guess what? You don't see anything in the game world. Why? Because it's right on top of my camera, right? In order for you to see this thing, it's got to be outside of your camera's view, right? So I'm just going to press the F key for my frame, kind of move my frame around. And notice here's my main camera. My main camera's right here. But look where it's looking. You can see that these little rays come out of the camera. Even though the camera looks like it's pointing this way, it's actually looking over here because of what I've clicked over here. So if I click one of these, it kind of moves things from different perspectives, right? Top right. Here's my top perspective. Notice I go from the right. If I click it again, it'll keep moving it to the front, right? And over here, notice this little perspective. There's little perspective lines here next to right. If I click on the actual name right, it actually goes to orthographic view. So you can actually look at it orthographically from one side or the other, right? If you really want to do that. But we were interested in perspective mode here. And again, if I tumble around the scene, notice I can move it around. Well, it looks like my cube isn't inside the viewable area where the camera is looking. It's got to be somewhere over here, right? Because my camera is looking this way, but my cube is behind the camera. So for me to move this, I'm going to left click on the cube, and I'm going to move it into my camera's view, maybe a little bit up. Right? Now, it looks like the camera should be able to see it, but I'm only looking at it from this weird perspective, right? Let's see if the camera sees it. Yay, there it is. You can see that in the camera, I can see my cube. It looks like a square. Why? Because it's directly in front of the camera now. And if I left click it and move it down a little bit, and if I move into the game side, you can see that now it's down here. Let's add in a plane. So I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to go create a new 3D object, plane. By the way, notice that my cube is highlighted here. That's bad. If you click away and then right click and go 3D object plane, then it'll put it inside of the scene below my cube. And notice that there's shadows in here. This is all generated automatically for you. In real life, when we're really being 3D game creation people, we generate all this by hand, right, with OpenGL, right? So this is why Unity is used so much. It's the most popular free game engine, that's what they're called, that you can download and install and make games with, right? The most popular one because it's free, it's easy to use, you can drag and drop, which we kind of sort of did, right? Or right click and kind of put stuff in. And I can drag things around. I can drag my plane around, right? In different positions, right? And if I want to, I can also left click, I can also rotate my my object across different axes. We're going to talk about this later on. And notice this is my rotation is by eye. I can do any kind of motions by eye here. But if I want to be numeric, I can do it here. So if I, for example, if I want to unrotate that, I can make it go to 0 and then 0 and 0. Right? So I can rotate by numerically, or I can do it by eye. Normally we want to do it numerically if we can. And from a position perspective, notice that it's 0.16 and minus 4.31. These two things are in Unity units, which are meters by default, right? So 0.16 meters, minus 0.16 meters. This is a minus because it's behind the axis of of the world axis, global space. I'm not going to talk about global to local because it's beyond the scope of this course. But this is where it is, right? And if I want to move this into the 0 space, you can see that there's not much change, right? But this one will definitely change. If I move this to 0, you can see that that's the 0, 0, 0 point of the world. Right? Now, how does this look from a camera perspective? You can see that it's farther away because my camera sits at 0, 1, minus 10, right? That's in three-dimensional space, right? Questions so far? Unity interface. That's all I'm talking about here. Do I need you to remember this? What if you don't want to use Unity for your final assignment? It's okay. You can use Visual Studio to create your interface if you want. I'm just giving you the opportunity for a little bit of enrichment if you really want to use the Unity interface. And so you can do rapid application development across different platforms. In fact, Unity, if I was going to give you a brief overview, if I go to Unity, if I go to File, and if I go to Build Settings, you can see where it can deploy to. Right now, it's deploying to PC, Mac, Linux standalone, right? Definitely, make sure you download that piece, right? Then there's iOS, tvOS, Android, Tizen, which is a Samsung thing, WebGL, Samsung TV, Xbox One, PS Vita, PS4, pretty soon the Nintendo Switch. I'm sure it's going to come. A bunch of other ones. And by the way, these are just the defaults. You can get more depending on the vendor. If you actually go to the vendor directly, there's a lot of platforms. I think it hits something like 24 different platforms where you can actually deploy. Why would you care about this? Okay, so we're not making a game. I want to make something for Apple TV, an application for Apple TV. I can do that here, right? Not a game, an Apple TV app, right? Or I want to make something that runs on Android, right, or iOS, or both. And this is a great alternative to creating iOS native applications, right? So I don't have to know anything about Swift or Xcode or anything like that. As long as you have a Mac, you can create an iOS application. Same thing with Android. You want to deploy Android, you can deploy on your device, on a tablet or a phone. You can do that using this. How about the web? And by the way, for your app, for your project, your final project or your final assignment number 5, I'm going to ask you to make it for web, right? Why? Because that way it's available for everybody, right? So WebGL, for the most part, works. So if you want to we're going to make a little game at the end. It's going to be a slot machine. And if you want to make it work for web, then everyone can see it. And it's easy for me to mark because I don't have to worry if you're a PC or Mac person. It's cross-platform, right? So we're going to use the web to create your application. And let me show you a quick build of how this works. So I've got this little game now, right? And I want to deploy for the web. So you notice that there's build and run. And this is how simple it is. If I click on build and run, it asks me for where I want to put it. Typically, we put it inside of a builds folder outside of the assets folder. So it's not going to appear here. It's going to be outside of this. So a new folder called builds. And we might make another folder in here. For this one, we're going to call this WebGL. Right, there's my WebGL build, and inside here we're going to call this my WebGL builds, whatever you want to call it. Here's my WebGL builds. Right, and click on save. And what this is going to do is it's going to convert everything that we have from a scripts perspective. If we had any scripts, all your three-dimensional objects, it's going to create them and wrap them with JavaScript and web technologies and display them on, something that's web compatible. Right? Unity, the great thing about Unity, has a little server that's built in, so it actually can display everything for you. If you were to double-click, this thing wouldn't work properly. You need some kind of server. However, if you had something, instead of Chrome, if you were using something like Firefox, and if you right-click and start it with Firefox instead of Chrome, it would perfectly work. But Chrome blocks it. So please don't try and double-click on Chrome. But really, you're creating a web, kind of application that's cross-platform. Notice it takes a little bit of time. I have 16 gigs of RAM. I have at least a 2 gig video card. It's not so bad. My system requirements are pretty good, but it's taking its sweet time, right? So keep this in mind when you're building your application. Every time you build it and you want to test it live and you want to test it physically on your system, it's going to take several minutes for this to come up. I'm going to come back to this because this is something that we're going to leave to run. Any questions around the basic Unity interface? I'm not going to go too much detail today because it's really high level. Anyone use Unity before? I know some people you've used it. So this is something of a review for you. All right, there's nothing that's new here. I'm not even touching things like materials or textures or making anything neat, any kind of scripting. There's a lot of stuff that comes out of the box with Unity, right? For example, if I want to make this into a kind of a first-person perspective game, I can do that within about 10 minutes, right? Believe it or not. If I want to make a first-person shooter, no problem, right? Unity supports it almost out of the box. It's going to look very Unity-like in 10 minutes, right? But it's okay. For us, no problem. And we're not making a first-person perspective or shooter game in this course. We're going to make a slot machine that you can make on Visual Studio, right? So if you don't want to make something on Unity, you don't have to. I'm not going to force you. It's just an option for those people who are interested in game development or cross-platform development with Unity. Yeah. Sorry? No, no. Minecraft is made from scratch, believe it or not, right? With OpenGL. So it's really good, but it's very similar. You can make it look very Unity-like, but Minecraft it's kind of an innovation, right? It wasn't intended to look like that. It was made with voxels. That's what it was actually created with, but it wasn't intended to stay like that. It was actually originally not supposed to look like that, and then afterwards, it just became really popular. But good question. I like it. Minecraft is still probably the most popular game with kids, right? Okay, so here we go. Here's my lesson 8. It's made with Unity. It's in a browser, right? And there we go. So it's a three-dimensional object. And now there's nothing to do here. There's no movement, whatever. But at the end of the day, you can see that it works in a browser as well as things. So that's what I'm saying. Unity is a great platform for cross-platform rapid application development, right? And that's why I'm bringing it to you as an alternate. Let's not always focus on Visual Studio. Visual Studio is great for Microsoft. And if you're a PC user, you're going to use Visual Studio because it's bundled with Unity, or it'll ask you if you want to use the Community Edition. Please don't download and install the Community Edition if you already have Enterprise. That doesn't make any sense, right? But you can point to which of your IDs, your editors, are going to be used by Unity. You can use Visual Studio Code if you really prefer that. If you're a Mac user, you might use MonoDevelop, which is built in. Actually, it'll be built in with Mac, and you don't have to use Visual Studio at all, right? Which is totally cool. So questions about Unity? Yay. All right, cool. We're not going to do more of that until later on. But notice it built, right? So it totally built my scene. Now let's take a look at it from I want to see the actual files themselves. I have something called Unity projects here on my desktop. If I double click and look at my files today, here's what it actually looks like: assets, builds, library, project settings, and temp. If I look at my assets, notice that I have some things here, and I also have something called scenes meta. Right? These meta files kind of talk about what's in my scenes. Right now, they're empty. These scenes, or my folders, are pretty much empty except for this one. If I was to put this up on GitHub, guess what I'm going to have? I'm only going to have my scenes folder. The rest of them are going to be non-existent because there's nothing in them, right? If I don't have anything in my models folder or in my scripts folder or any one of these other folders, it means that it's not going to be there. Now, in order for me to put things up on GitHub, and I'm telling you this from the very first day we're doing Unity, you need to shut Unity down. Okay, there is no integration with GitHub built into Unity. All right? There's Perforce. There's a bunch of other things that are integrated there, but we don't have access to those things right now very easily. So let's go back to Unity. So I'm going to shut this down. I'm going to file, save my project, right? And I'm going to file, save my scene if I made any changes to my scene, and then I'm going to quit Unity. When I quit Unity, it shuts down some of these meta tags, right? And now I need to do this is something that of a bit of a pain for those people. So I want to give you a sense of all the things you need to do if you're going to choose Unity as your final platform for your assignment 5, okay? It takes a little bit more work to do here. Let's be honest with you. It's harder to do with Unity than it is to do with Visual Studio in the beginning. No, not yet. Skip this version. So I would download, I kind of do the CD space, and I would download or drag and drop my Unity folder into my terminal or command prompt. And here I would do a git init by hand, git add dots, right? Just like we normally would do with GitHub, and then git commit -m, we'll call it initial commit. We add all those files into the local folders, right? And now I want to put this up on GitHub, right? So again, I would kind of go to my GitHub version, right? And I'm going to go new, and I'm going to put in COMP1004, winter 2017, and we're going to say lesson 8, Unity, right? So we know what it is, right? Here's my lesson 8 Unity, and I'm going to grab these last 2 lines here, go back into my terminal, and paste them, and press enter, and you're going to see that I'm going to put everything that I just made. My Unity project is going to be up on GitHub in a second. So if you weren't able to follow along, or you want to check this out later on, or download my project and make it work later on for yourself, go up on GitHub. I've downloaded my project, including the build. By the way, we normally do not include the build because the build can be very big, right? Notice that I have in my WebGL build, you can download and install this thing, and it'll tell you how big it is. Now let's take a look and see how much room this took up, this whole operation. If I right-click here on my folder and go to get info on the Mac, you can see that I have about 70 megs, 77 megs. I didn't do anything. Like I put a couple of objects on the screen, 77 megs is big, right? Why? Because of my builds folder, yeah. You can create something called a gitignore file, and a gitignore file, you would disclude builds, right? So inside, and I'll show you how to do that. Inside gitignore file, you just put in builds, that whole folder, and then that would not be included in your upload, right? And you wouldn't want to do this in the future. When we do more of the Unity stuff, we're not going to include it. But notice that, so the whole thing is 77 megs. Let's right-click on the builds folder and see how big that is. 5 megs out of 77. So still, there's a lot of overhead, right? Still 5 megs, like, you know, I mean, it's only for the build. So what am I going to ask for you for your final assignment 5, if you're going to use Unity? Just the build. I don't care about the rest, right? Because the rest is your project files or whatever. I want the project files up on the Blackboard, but the build is the one I want up on GitHub because, actually, probably the other way around. Everything up on the regular files on GitHub, and then just the build on Blackboard, right? Because if I download from the Blackboard, double-click with Firefox, and I'm running your code. Like that's how fast it'll be, right? Nice and easy. So marking will be, you know, easy for me, and it'll be easy for you to set it up. All right, so that's Unity in a nutshell. Let's continue with a little bit of what we're talking about today. So again, it's an alternate. Am I going to make you do Unity? What if you don't want to learn Unity? Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you're saying, I don't want to learn Unity. I don't care about that, Tom. I want to learn Visual Studio. I think it's more practical from a business perspective. Sure, it's more practical. More and more people are going to do more and more three-dimensional interfaces coming up, just letting you know. From an emerging technology perspective, they're looking at different ways to make it more interesting for people to work. And especially from a training perspective, you know, it gives you the opportunity to train people in a more interesting way with serious games. Like Flash?
Yeah.
It's like Flash, but it's not really like Flash. Like if I want to deploy my Unity game, and I made a Unity game with a couple of students at UIT, it took us about 16 hours to kind of slap things together, and I really mean that. Slap things together, right? Check out mazescape.ca. It's a game we kind of made with Unity. It took us, like I said, about 16 hours of just slapping things together. I'm not going to tell you I'm super proud or anything like that. It's just a game we made, a 3D game with a bit of some stuff. It's up on Azure. So we deployed it on Azure. We're serving it from Azure, right? So it has its own domain and everything else, and you can try it out yourself. This is purely made with Unity in the last version. And you can see that I've got a 3D kind of game, right? And I can move around, and it's very, very Unity-like, right? And if I want to escape from this, you can see that I can escape. I have to press my escape key, or else I'm never going to see my mouse again. There we go. But you can try that out, and it's purely made with Unity. So go, you know, that's something that you can totally do. It doesn't take you a lot of time to make this stuff, and the scripting is very simple. Your C# scripting is like, I would call it light scripting. It's not heavy scripting. Okay? All right, let's go into the more stuff we're doing today. So I want to launch Visual Studio for this one before we stop for the break here. And so far what we've done is we've created interfaces, and our interfaces have no data component whatsoever, right? So that's kind of useless. Like most of the time in enterprise or anything else, we always have some kind of data store that we use. Now there's a lot to choose from nowadays. It's not just SQL Server from Microsoft. You could choose very popular NoSQL databases like MongoDB. That's very popular these days. You could also choose MySQL, MySQL. So somewhere in the cloud, you get your database, right? I'm going to make a new project here. And we're just going to call this midterm assignment. No, I'm going to make this from scratch. So I'm just going to go into our form, our regular form again. So Windows Forms application. I'm going to choose the name COMP1004, Winter 2017. That's an 8, just like the other one. Okay, in your GitHub repository or Git repository, press OK. It's going to create an empty application. All right. The things to understand here is you need to attach or bind to a data source. Right now, if I create a couple of simple fields, and let's create some fields I want to load up. I want to have a list of names, something like a list of names, right? So maybe I'll have a list box. Here's a list box. And my list box in my form, we're just going to call this form we'll call it our data form. So I'm going to rename this to, and by the way, I'm going to right-click rename. This is the right thing to do. To data form, right? And I'm going to say yes, of course, to accept that. It's going to propagate. I want to make our data form, first of all, go up to the top and change the auto scale. Our auto scale version is going to come away from font. I don't want that. I want it to go to none. Here's none. Auto scale none. And I want to change my font. Here's my font size itself. I'm going to change that to something like 16 or 14, maybe 14. How about that? Leave it Microsoft. A little bit bigger, though. And we'll change the name of the form itself, or the title on the title bar, to data form. Data form. Our start position will be center screen. These are all typical changes we make. I want to ask you to do, because these are just things, that we basic stuff. Now I could certainly, in my list box, and we covered list boxes very briefly before we went on break. I could create my list box, and I could, if I go to my smart arrow here, I could use list edit items, and I could select a list of names. So let's say, for example, Tom, Mike, John, I don't know, Aaron, Nathan, other names, Jane, whatever. Some names that we have here, right? That's okay. Notice that now it fills up with a bunch of names. And but these are hard-coded names that are here. It doesn't really give me any flexibility. What if I had a name database that I could connect to for users? Well, maybe we're going to call this the name list box, right? So this is the name list box. In fact, it's probably first name list box. Our first name list box, right? And this is fine, right? But the problem with this is a couple things, right? When I run this application, notice that there is nothing selected. Again, going back to lists and arrays, by default, nothing selected, right? And it comes from a hard-coded data source, which is just my list that I've entered in the user interface. That's bad. Even if I was to hard code this from a coding perspective, that would be bad, right? We want to be able to bring in something from a data source somewhere. Now, there's different data sources you can use with Microsoft Visual Studio. You could use some kind of, I hate to say it, I'm going to say it low, access database. You could use an access database. You could use an Excel spreadsheet if you really wanted to. You could use a text file if you really wanted to as a data store. Not recommended. We never use this in real life. We always use some kind of real data, typically somewhere. And we use some kind of data store that's on the cloud or somewhere in a server. The most common one to use with Microsoft is SQL Server. Okay, SQL Server. So how do I set that up? I'm going to go on the Mac side for a second and set it up. I need to have access to Microsoft Azure. We talked about this a couple times. You can get to it by going to portal.azure.com. My assumption is by now you have access, right? If you don't have access to Microsoft Azure, you need to get at what the. Oh, I like this. Oh yeah, it redirects me nicely. Let's go into my incognito window. Yeah, that might be better. Portal.azure.com. And here you can put in your username. I'm just using my generic one. And it's probably going to ask me to log in with my two-step authentication. Where is it? There we go. In a second, it will. Guaranteed, yeah. Let's take a look here. All right, so we're going to go in and take a look at my authenticator. I have an authenticator app on my phone. I use two-step because exactly for this reason. I'm always broadcasting like this, just in case someone figures out what my password is, right? And yeah, sure. Doesn't make a difference because I'm in incognito mode. So now I'm going to go to my Azure portal, and this is what it looks like. Okay, because we're not a web course, I want to give you some hints and also some warnings. One, you've got a limited amount of space with Microsoft Azure. All right, if you're going to use Azure for your SQL Server, you can make one SQL server in one location, right? And you can only have one database that's in that SQL server as a student, right? However, I can make multiple SQL servers. I create instances of multiple SQL servers across different locations. And I'm okay, what do I mean by locations? Let's make a SQL server, right? And again, this is something you need to do. This is a requirement, guys and girls, for assignment number 4. Please take a look, right? So I'm going to click New. Actually, notice on here I have SQL databases. I definitely want this one. But notice that there's a name. I can go this way. I can create a database this way, or I can go back to here one day, and it's going to build up a data store. I've got some kind of databases. You can choose a SQL database, a warehouse, NoSQL database with DocumentDB, don't recommend, and other ones. Let's choose this one. By the way, as students, you have access. Notice that I have DreamSpark. It says DreamSpark. Yours might say Imagine, same thing, right? It's a Microsoft program that gives free access to students and professors for a limited time, usually for about a year now, right? All right, so what's my database name? This is the database server, right, that I want. No, it's not, or actually, this is the database name. Then we have to create the database server. So my database name is going to be called COMP1004, and it's going to be some kind of names database, right? The names DB, right? So COMP1004. And then I'm going to put names. That's what the database is going to be called. I'm trying to make it unique. Okay. Notice it says, "Hey, what do you want to use?" I want to use an existing resource group. You can choose a resource group here. I'm going to choose Canada East. Remember, these resource groups are what we call locations, right? This is where the data center is. One database server, one location. You cannot make 2 database servers in the same location. You will get an error. It will not allow you to. Number 1. 2, select the source, a blank database. That's okay. Leave it blank, right? Configure the server. So first we make the database name, COMP1004 names, and the second one is the server. So here's the server. Notice that there's a couple servers I have up and running right now that they're kind of still running. We're going to make another one. The server has to be in a unique location, right? And I'm kind of concerned with these two that they're still showing up. That might mean it's very bad, right? But let's see what happens. Notice it says database.windows.net. That's the last part of the server. This part has to be unique, right? So I'm going to call it COMP1004. That's the server name. Notice that it is taken. There is no COMP1004 that's available for me to use, right? How about -winter 2017? Is that available? Yes, it is, right? And I have to create a username, a password, and to confirm my password. My username is going to be, of course, the one I always use. My password, I can try and make it unconventional, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it gives you a error, right? So we're going to make it so it's something that you can read. So it's capital G for Georgian. It's going to be 2017 with an exclamation mark at the end. Georgian 2017 exclamation mark. That's okay. Checks out location. Here we go again. Central, right? Notice I have one for Central already and another one for Canada East. If I try and make it in Central, it's going to fail, right? We don't want that. So let's move it somewhere else. And you can also choose Central US or East US. Let's go East US. That's fine. Notice that East US is different than these two, right? Select. It's going to, that part is done. The server part is done. You want to use SQL Elastic Pool. Not now. We don't need that. Pricing tier should stay free. If it says pay as you go, if it says some other kind of pricing tier, you'll be charged through the nose. Please do not do this. SQL servers cost at least $15 a month, right? So if somehow you've got to the point you made some kind of error and it says some other thing other than free, that's bad. Don't select this, okay? Don't select anything other than free. And if you click onto this, you can see that there is different pricing categories. You want this one, right? I'm going to pin to my dashboard and click Create. If I've done things correctly, only if I've done things correctly, it's going to generate my database server. This is the first piece to you guys doing your database work for the second half of semester. You need to have this piece working, right? If you can't do this, it doesn't have to be on Azure. I recommend Azure, though. You can use other places like DreamHost, anywhere else that supports a SQL database. That's okay, right? Microsoft does it very well. Okay. Still generating. And if you look over here, it's still doing its deployment dance. My server is got to create two things. My server, the VM from my server is being created right now, a micro VM. That's only going to be for my server. That's in a shared machine somewhere. I'm not using dedicated server space somewhere. That's too expensive, right? And then it's going to create my database, only one database per server, physically for me. So I don't have to go in there and create the database. You cannot create other databases. I can make many tables, which is what I'm going to make a names table, first names table I'm going to make today, right? And we're going to connect to it. And it's not going to take a lot of logic to do this. We're going to talk about the old way, which I'm going to show you today, and the new way. When I say the new way, we're going to be using an entity relational mapper, right? An ERM mapper called the entity framework, right? Entity framework allows us to connect to SQL database without using SQL commands. We can use, it's a much simpler method-based connection string that we're going to be using. And when we deal with doing things like full CRUD, that means creating, reading, updating, and deleting, right? We can use the entity framework, which is the more modern framework, the more modern approach to connecting to a database and doing things with structured query language. You can see how long this takes, right? Oh, success. Yeah, I did it right. All right, so there we go. It's recorded for you guys to see. Notice that I have this database. It's COMP1004-W2017.database.windows.net. That is my database server, not my database. My database is called COMP1004 names, right? And if you want to see that, if you notice on the left-hand side, we have overview, right? We have my pricing tier. These are all things that are part of this. But if I want to see my databases, right, inside of our, this is my server. But my database itself, if I click on my server, left-click on my server, on the left, you're going to see that I have one database that's called COMP1004 names. That's my database. Cool. Now, in order for me to connect to my database, I need something called a connection string, okay? Visual Studio has all that baked in, but only if you've downloaded and installed Visual Studio 2015 with Enterprise Update 3 correctly. If you haven't, or if it's some other version, then you may see something different than me. Doesn't mean that you can't do it with other versions, but it's the easiest way to do it. How do I know this? Let's go to Visual Studio for a second, then we'll take a break. All right, so on the left, notice that I have all this toolbox, this common toolbox. I dragged and dropped this list, right? That's cool, but I want to create to a data source. Well, on the left, you can see I have something called data services or data sources. Okay, nothing here, right? What else do I have? I have something called Server Explorer. Yay, Server Explorer. And if I refresh, notice it says re-enter your credentials, Tom. Doesn't know who I am, so I'm going to re-enter them. And when I re-enter my credentials, I have to put in my password with my, again, two-step authentication, because I want to keep secure. And there it is. And submit. It's going to give me a list up on Azure eventually when I log in. If I open up my Cloud Explorer, it should show me one day. Here's my pay-as-you-go stuff. Here's my DreamSpark stuff. Notice I have my SQL databases over here, and there it is. See how it shows up? Now that's what I'm talking about, right? As opposed to going to swim around, trying to find the connection string and all that kind of stuff. Bam, it's right here, okay? Why is this important? Well, because if I click onto this thing, right, and if I go to, now one, I can open it in a portal. I can open up in SQL Server Object Explorer, which is what I want. Now, SQL Server Object Explorer can be found by going to View, and if you look down here, if you're using Visual Studio 2015 with Enterprise, on the top, it's SQL Server Object Explorer on the top, okay? Well, let's go back, right? If I go to my Server Explorer, and again, if I look at Cloud Explorer, which is here, Cloud Explorer is only going to be there if you've downloaded the right extensions. And if I open up in SQL Server Object Explorer, then you're going to see another list that comes up, or this error. I love this error, where I can't connect. And I wanted to point this out to you for a couple of reasons. One, here's one reason that I can't connect. I'm wired in. Okay, I'm wired in. The wireless here at Georgian has the ability for us to connect to SQL Server, no problem. IT has opened up the ports for us. Wired, nah. Right, it's not going to work, right? So I have to disconnect. I can't do that right now because if I disconnect, I'm not going to be broadcasting anymore, right? So after the break, I'll just not use my wired, which might be slower on the broadcast, but it'll allow me to connect. So again, what I want to do is I want to create that connection here in SQL Server Object Explorer. Notice I have a couple of local ones. To practice for now, let's use a local data store. And notice that there are two that I have. One is called LocalDB, MS SQL LocalDB. That's local to your machine, right? That's probably the one you have, right? I also have one from a previous version of Visual Studio. Both of them are little microservers that are running in the background, okay? Let's use this one. And if I kind of click the down arrow, you can see that I have a bunch of databases. These are databases on the same database server under MS SQL LocalDB, a bunch of them, right? And if I want to, I can go to COMP1004, here's my database, and I might have some available tables already. Here's some tables on COMP1004. I have a couple. I have something called buildings and another one called students. I'm just going to get rid of these, just so that way you and I can do something new. By the way, it's okay if you don't have those or if it's not available to you. One really cool tool that I highly recommend if you're doing any kind of database work, which means you should already have this already, is something called SQL Server Management Studio. It's free for students, right? If you go up on Microsoft Imagine, you can download it for free, and it's a little bit better than the integrated version that's built into Visual Studio 2015, okay? All right, so I have my COMP1004 database, but what if I didn't? How could I set up a new database here? I could go up to the top where it says add a new SQL server, right? I could connect somehow to Azure if I wanted to. Notice that if it picks up my Azure, here's my Azure new database that I created, COMP1004 names. And it also gives me my default login and password. I can put my password in, which is just capital G for Georgian, 2017. Oh, I messed that one up. I messed that one up too. And I remember password, and it's not going to let me do it because I'm wired in. It's going to block me for a second. If I click connect, it's going to say sorry, can't connect because I'm being blocked here. And it says, look, the app. Oh yeah, this is another reason. See my IP address? That's another thing we have to clear up. Maybe this will fix it. Here, where my IP address is 192.139.153. That's my local IP. Blocked. Yes, I forgot this part. Let's go back for a second onto the server side. Here we are. Notice on this server, on the left, we have something called firewall, right? On the firewall side, it's picking up my local, my client IP, but this doesn't make any sense. This is a local IP in my subnet. That's not going to make any sense to the server. It needs to have an outside IP address, which I cannot provide at this time. So I don't know which one of the numerous IP addresses that I'm connected to. So for now, we're going to make a new rule called everyone. I recommend you do this as well. And my start IP is 0.0.0.0 and 255.255.255.0. By the way, is it recommended to do this right in real life? Hell no. This is like opening up for anyone to administer my server. But for us, the great thing about this is it opens up the possibilities. We're not being blocked from a firewall perspective for administrative purposes. Cool, we've updated everything on this. We've saved everything, right? And again, all I did was I went into, for people who didn't see this or I went too fast, I went to overview. On the left, there's firewall. And then I had to add a new firewall setting rule called everyone, where I go from 0.0.0.0 to 255.255.255.0. That's the subnet, which is everything. That allows everyone in. And then I had to click save. Cool, let's try that again, that connection. Okay, so I got my, let's make sure I type my password one more time. I'll be really annoying if I just type my password wrong. Click connect. Oh my God, I think it might work. Yes, they've done lots of work, these security people, these IT people, to let us in. All right, so cool. So I should have access to this thing. Well, okay, well, where is it? Right, because I've connected, this is my local DB. Where is it that's remote? I mean, I've connected to the remote one. So if I go to my Cloud Explorer, right, here's my Cloud Explorer. And if I right click and open this up, yeah, see, it's not quite perfect. So I'm connected, but I can't do anything because I'm local, right? So if I refresh, yeah, it's not going to do anything because I'm local and I'm connected with the wire, right? What was that? Yes. We're going to take a break right now. Any questions about the SQL database server we have to create? We must create a SQL database server somewhere, whether it's on Azure, whether it's on DreamHost, whether there's another, and I'm going to suggest other ones as well. But we need to have something on the cloud for this second half of the semester because we need to do some kind of data. All right? All right, cool. Let's take a short break. And when we come back, let's see if I can post assignment number 4 early, and then you guys can continue with what we're doing and get some coffee, which I think some of us need.